really hard to win seats, but also in some of these defensive seats. And so you can imagine that the tone did start to change within her circle, and her expectations did start to change, while still, you know, being ambitious, but in some seats, but nevertheless, you know, probably realising that things weren't going her way.
I think we can see, I think we can just about see the car having pulled up to the top right of that shot.
Yes, I think,
as I understand it, she will go in through the King's Steps.
Yes, the Prime Minister's car will pull in at the bottom of the steps there. There will be a picture of this later, but it's not being offered up for us to take live. Interestingly, I don't think you'll have any images of Theresa May meeting the Queen today. She obviously has met her as her Prime Minister many times before. She has the weekly audience with her. But, of course, we can speculate. There were points last night when people were wondering whether Jeremy Corbyn would be making this journey today and going up those steps and being met by the Queen's equerry and off to see Her Majesty for the first time as Prime Minister.
And then, of course, this precedes her then forming a government, and it's who serves in that government now that there'll be very many questions about.
Yes, she's clearly made the decision that she's going to run a minority administration backed up with that, not a formal deal with the DUP, the 10 MPs that the DUP have delivered from Northern Ireland, but that's clearly her decision. And here we are, we're in the quad now, and this is the car's obviously already gone in. We'll get those pictures turned around for you as soon as we possibly can. But you know, the conversation she'll have with the Queen is that, yes, Your Majesty, I can form a government and I can lead that government, but she doesn't have enough of her own MPs to do it alone.
And we'll wait to see what she says when she returns to Downing Street. We're going to take a short break now, but we'll have all the latest on that trip to Buckingham Palace very soon. Do stay with us. The view of Buckingham Palace, where Theresa May arrived just a few moments ago for a meeting with the Queen to say that she would be forming a government. Alongside me in our studio, Professor Jane Green and Chris Shipp, who've been following events this morning. And she is pressing ahead. Whatever pressures and anger and recrimination may be building within her own party, these are very clear images of a woman with determination going to the palace to press ahead. What is your thoughts on that, Jane?
You know, spent quite a long time last night thinking about the implications of the result and thinking that this would surely steer the Conservative Party away from a hard Brexit, and also might steer the Conservative Party away from the ability to start negotiations in 10 days' time. It seems to me that what she's doing is you know, staying very much on course with that timetable, and very interesting if she does stick to her Brexit means Brexit and her hard Brexit position, because it hasn't been successful for her. So she's lost support, and she might be pursuing a strategy and a policy position that has actually might undermine her even further.
I mean, what she does in the next few hours is crucial. I mean, who does she appoint to does she appoint everyone to their old jobs? We know, for example, there were some very bad arguments, shall we say, between Theresa May's inner circle, these two advisors that we're talking about more and more at the moment, Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, and her then-Chancellor, as he was, or still is today, actually, Philip Hammond. Now, everyone presumed that come the election, if she had this big stonking majority that she was hoping for, she would fire Philip Hammond straight away, because he was sort of, you know, making difficult her life when it came to Brexit. She doesn't have those options now, and what she does is going to be very important. What she's doing about Boris Johnson, we've already discussed this morning how he's on manoeuvres because he can see a leadership election coming down the line. And then we've got this this bank of Tory MPs. I say big, it's not as big as she wanted it to be, but Sarah Wollaston, a Tory MP down in the southwest, has already been tweeting that she needs to fire these two advisors because they clearly advised her really badly during this whole campaign.
And the result itself and the pressure that puts on what sort of negotiations she then pursues, should things go ahead according to the timetable?
Absolutely extraordinary. I mean, if Theresa May doesn't change her position on Brexit, then she really is just, you know, I repeat myself in a way, but it's just very important, I think, that she would be pursuing a strategy that has been unsuccessful, and that would be an extraordinary way to try to unite the Conservative Party, who has looked aghast at her campaign, her manifesto and her electoral strategy, to then press on with that, with her authority undermined, and remember also her popularity in the country also weakened, would, I think, be a big surprise. And so, you know, as you say, the next few hours are going to be absolutely crucial and very interesting.
She fought a campaign based on a certain type of Brexit, which was leaving the single market, out of the customs union, and she's gone backwards. I mean, when you look at those facts, she simply cannot continue in the same way, and we wait to see. We're presuming, we don't know for sure, but we're presuming she'll say something when she, after a meeting with the Queen, she comes back into Downing Street. It's quite possible she'll just run into the door, Julie, but she might have to say something, because I think people now, at this stage of the day, do need to hear from her.
Yes, and these images themselves, but also the words that we hear from her and how soon we hear them are crucial in terms of actually at a point where there's a great deal of uncertainty. We can just see those enormous clouds gathering over Buckingham Palace. Extraordinary as we're talking about
before
this.
The Prime Minister got there.
I'm not entirely sure that's true, Chris. But, you know, there is a pressure on the imagery around this at this point as well, in terms of reassurance, I suppose.
Yes, and I think, you know, that podium outside, you know, that's where Prime Ministers actually have an advantage at times like this. They put the podium out in front of the black door of number 10. They look very Prime Ministerial, and that has worked for her very well, up until she came sort of crashing down to reality last night, when she, you know, she's gone backwards and lost seats as to where David Cameron was in 2015. But the words, they are working on them right now. They're probably still editing them as we speak. Those words she's about to deliver, if she does indeed give a speech, are absolutely crucial.
I think people will be looking to see some humility as well from Theresa May. Certainly those in the party, and certainly those in the country who have voted, you know, because they were concerned about the direction of Brexit the country was going in. You know, we've seen the Remain votes, we've seen the Remain turnouts, and I think, you know, people will be looking for that, certainly in a parliamentary party. It wouldn't surprise me if we don't get that, though, and that we get a sort of hard determination to press on, and I'm not quite sure that's going to be the right tone.
And I suppose that actually puts the finger also on her sort of solitude at the heart of government, doesn't it? And that's what everybody has talked about, that characterises the way that she's governed. She's just got this very tight circle around her, and it means that, yes, they can keep things, they can keep a lid on things in terms of, certainly when they announced the election. I mean, it was an extraordinarily well-kept secret for those few days. But it also means that on moments like this, when the pressure is on, there are few people that she can turn to.
Absolutely right. And you know, you had Katie Perry in the studio earlier, the former Director of Communications for 10 Downing Street, up until the day that, or the day before Theresa May announced this, they didn't tell her about it. Now that gives you an idea that if you're not telling your Director of Comms that you're planning a snap general election, then you've just basically frozen everybody out. The Cabinet felt frozen out, the other MPs felt frozen out, and the Director of Comms clearly felt frozen out, and she left when the election announcement was made. And this is the problem with having such a tight inner circle.
You also have the element of surprise, but by excluding those other people, you don't have a lot of very good, thoughtful planning for a campaign, which seems to have
cross now to... Sorry to interrupt, Jane. We can... some shots of Jeremy Corbyn in North London at a cafe there, presumably pretty close to his home, and being greeted very warmly by... just some of the passers-by, it looks, saying thank you to some of the police officers. Let's see if we can hear what he's had to say, even if he's just chatting to the police officers.
You're going to move back? No, I don't
So you're just writing my shot?
I know, because you're supposed to say that. Afternoon, Jeremy, did you have a good lunch?
That's our correspondent, Rachel Younger, you can hear.
Good afternoon, Jeremy, how was your lunch?
Well done.
Good afternoon, Jeremy. Can we grab a quick word, please, on ITV News? Hello, Jeremy. How
We're just walking down the street to our home now. Thank you ever so much, everybody, for coming.
With our
Wonderful
Rachel.
of you to be here.
Thank
you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Who doubted you?
Thank you very much. Thank you. How are you doing? Okay. Hello. How are you doing? Hi.
So, good luck to
Thank you.
It's a not unfamiliar sight, as we've come to recognise over these months of Jeremy Corbyn being pursued by a reporter but not necessarily actually speaking to them in the process. But what a contrast between Buckingham Palace and what is happening there and the streets of North London. Jeremy Corbyn out and about talking to people just coming and going about their business, with his wife Lara at his side. We don't often get a glimpse of her, but he's looking pretty chipper, isn't he, as he makes his way down that high street in London, having a chat with people as he goes. And he, like the rest of us, will be contemplating what is being planned in Downing Street and how he may have to respond to it in the coming hours. Chris, I suppose that's one of the really interesting aspects of this. Great pictures to watch, but what must be going through his mind?
You can see there, and just these images we're getting in live from North London at the moment, you can just see there the reaction he is getting. And increasingly, although Labour put a lot of their efforts into safe seats, he was creating this sort of buzz around him, this crowd, this momentum. And I think people felt like they were seeing a very authentic politician. Poor old Rachel there, just trying to run in front of the camera as we film him. This looks like could possibly be his street, so he's obviously just around the corner from where he lives. But I think people were seeing this authenticity that they were not getting from Theresa May. And, you know, walking down the street there, being hugged in that way, could you imagine that happening in Maidenhead, for example, Theresa May's constituency? And I'm not sure you would.
I think, you know, it's worth remembering just how well Labour's done. So although Labour's clearly lost and very difficult to make a coalition work with the numbers, it's not just the fact that it was against expectations, it's the style, it's the kind of win, it's the voters that Jeremy Corbyn has inspired, the young, turning out in numbers we just don't remember seeing.
Yes, and just a few miles away from that, what a very different scene, the helicopter shots above Buckingham Palace, of course, where Theresa May has been in there for the last few moments, speaking to the Queen about how she plans to form that government. Chris, you've got something for us.
It looks like, I don't know if we've got a shot of Downing Street at the moment, but it does look like a lectern has been put out in Downing Street, which means we're discussing now, is she going to speak, is she not going to speak after she sees the Queen? But there we go, right in the middle of the shot there, you can see the lectern. It's, I can't see whether the crest is on it. Remember we had this speculation when she launched the snap election?
Yes, indeed.
Was the crest on it or was it not?
Or not, yeah.
And because was she making the statement as the leader of the Conservative Party or the Prime Minister? I'm sure the crest is on there, so, you know, clearly, I mean, this is what we all expected, is that she's seen the Queen, she wants to form a government, she will be the Queen's Prime Minister, and she will now go back to Buckingham, back to Downing Street from Buckingham Palace and make a speech. A very important speech it will be too.
And hard to imagine, really. It was just July the 13th last year that we saw her stride up Downing Street after that extraordinary denouement to the Tory leadership contest where Andrea Leadsom stood aside and it all happened in that great flurry. I mean, that's a matter for the history books now, isn't it, when we contemplate what's unfolding.
And some people have been saying to me this morning, maybe if Theresa May had fleshed out her ideas, her battle plan a little bit more thoroughly over the summer, she might have been better placed for this election, but because she didn't have that, then, you know, she as many people are saying, she flopped.
And the key information we're obviously waiting to hear from her is there any information she's going to provide about the Unionists in Northern Ireland, being what kind of support they may or may not be willing to lend to her.
Yes, and as you mentioned before, Jane, it's about tone as well as content of this speech, isn't it, in the wake of having taken this extraordinary decision, having ruled out a snap election, then suddenly deciding, OK, now I'm going to read the runes and go for it.
I think so. I mean, one of the things that we know, obviously we're having a very tumultuous political time and we've seen a lot of volatility, lots of elections, lots of surprising election outcomes, lots of electoral volatility. And I think, you know, when she called that election, she perhaps did take that kind of lead for granted, perhaps her advisors suggested that she could. What I think she will be reflecting upon is the vulnerability of the Conservative position. Even though the Conservatives are slightly ahead of Labour in terms of vote share, that is a vulnerable position. So even the support that she's lost could be lost further. And I'd imagine that she would be more mindful about that than perhaps she was 6 or 7 weeks ago.
And presumably as well, Chris, seeking to reassure people simply about the timetable unfolding before us in the next couple of weeks, with MPs due to return to Westminster.
Yes,
yeah.
And there is that slimmed down state opening of Parliament, because, and actually at the time we were wondering whether it's because, you know, the Queen wears a very sort of heavy crown. She wears 2 crowns, actually, one on the way to the Palace of Westminster, and in the robing room of the Palace of Westminster she changes into the Imperial State Crown. But that's all been massively slimmed down. There's no carriages, it'll be cars this time. That was not really to do with this. It was because the snap election had suddenly interrupted the timetable of the Royal Mews, who sort of allocate the cars for all these special occasions. But we got this slimmed down Queen's speech coming our way. She's got to get that Queen's speech through, and part of the deal that she's now doing is, can she have a programme for government that she can get through the House of Commons? In other words, does she have the majority in the House of Commons to get the Queen's speech through? Based
on a manifesto that her MPs thought was disastrous.
Yes, and didn't get her the majority she was expecting.
So glorious shots of Buckingham Palace in the June, well, I'd say sunshine. Of course we saw it. ghastly cloud, so that's not quite true. But it's a lovely shot of Buckingham Palace, nonetheless. You'll forgive us, we've all been out for quite a long time. But let's cross to Rachel Younger, who's in North London with Jeremy Corbyn. That was a very valiant attempt. You nearly got there, Rachel, and I know so many occasions you do. But just tell us what's been happening there this morning. You're back outside Mr Corbyn's house by the looks of it.
That's right, yes. He's just popped out. He was at a cafe that's on the Seven Sisters Road, a local favourite of his, an Italian. He was there with his wife Lara, who's desperate to stay out of the spotlight. As you probably saw, he's very keen to protect her from that too. What he doesn't mind at all, though, as you saw, was the amount of well-wishing he's getting from locals, from supporters. He stopped, he posed for selfies with them. I think he gave a hug to the owner of one local cafe. He's very well known and well liked around here, of course, and he was enjoying it. I spoke to one of his very close advisors who said, look, of course, he is really happy right now. He's relaxed, and it's quite a difference, isn't it, from what we were expecting. I mean, if you think just a few days back, many people thought it would be him whose job, whose future might well be in question, with so many of the Labour Party having failed to support him inside of Parliament. Instead, he's the one who is most secure in his job, relaxed enough to take some time out from planning what to do next and just spend 40 minutes or so having brunch with his wife Lara there. Now, I spoke to a close aide of his earlier today and said, look, what is the plan for today? And they made it clear that this is all now about mapping out the way forward. He went straight to Labour headquarters this morning to thank his team, all those who've been campaigning so hard for him. And we heard him, didn't we? He said that he felt that he had won this. When asked the direct question of who had won this election, he said, I think that is clear. Of course, the reality is he feels like he's won, but he's lost. And Theresa May, well, she feels like she's lost, but she's won. And that gives rise to all kinds of complications. So he very quickly went into a room in Labour headquarters with John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor. They talked long and hard. He'll be having more meetings throughout the day, I understand, with other close members of his team, the likes of Andrew Gwynn and Ian Lavery, who ran the campaign for him, Emily Thornberry, the Foreign Secretary, and Keir Starmer, who of course would have responsibility for any kind of Brexit talks, expected to be part of that too. But they are really in a state of flux at the moment, just watching Theresa May. Not Jeremy Corbyn himself. He's, as you can see, not too concerned about what's going on at the palace, but his advisers will be watching very closely, and I think they will have plenty to say about the DUP. Already the line we're hearing is one that was thrown at them throughout this campaign, a coalition of chaos.
And his position in the party now, Rachel, if you're still with us, utterly consolidated within Labour.
Yeah, it feels rock solid, doesn't it? We had the likes of Yvette Cooper very early on this morning pledging their support. She did anyway, and sounded like she meant it. So it'll be very interesting. He wouldn't answer my question. I don't know whether you heard me asking whether he would be welcoming the Labour big beast back into the fold, onto his front bench. But I think he's likely to be pragmatic about that and will want to bring them back so that he has the strongest possible team.
Thank you, Rachel. We're keeping a close eye now on Buckingham Palace. We can take you to a shot of the Prime Ministerial car waiting. I'm not sure whether that is the one we should be looking at, but there is a car waiting to take the Prime Minister back to Downing Street, and as we were noting a few moments ago, the podium already in place in Downing Street, and all eyes, of course, will be on that podium to see what Prime Minister May has to say. A very short meeting with the Queen, but far more enormous pressures really on her once she leaves there in terms of what she says in Downing Street. And fair to say, Chris, really this was a speech none of that close inner circle could ever have imagined they'd have to be writing.
Yes, and you remember that speech that she made when she became Prime Minister back in July. It was written in large measure by this one of her two advisors, who's now coming under a lot of criticism, Nick Timothy. And a lot of it was focused on his own concerns from his Birmingham background about how people are being left behind, about how, you know, this is where a lot of the grammar school stuff came from, controversial as that turned out to be. Now, the big question now is who's written this speech? Is there a wider body of people who have had some involvement in this speech, or has it been left to these two advisors who ran this very close campaign and froze everybody else out? So it's a very important speech, and we'll, when she makes it in a few minutes' time, we'll check to see if there's any significant differences to the one that she made. But I think, as Jane was saying to us earlier, she has to get the humility right. If this is not a humble speech, then she really has got the tone completely wrong.
And here she is with her husband Philip, straight from that meeting with Her Majesty the Queen, the car awaiting her, and this will be a very difficult journey for Theresa May to make. Back down the Mall, back down to Downing Street, with the world's media awaiting, watching, reading everything possible into every word which has been prepared for her. So the car crosses the quadrangle out towards the front of the palace gates and is on its way. And we can cross very shortly, of course, to Downing Street, as the waiting reporters, not least our correspondent Carl Dinnan, will be in line to hear what the Prime Minister has to say. Police outriders in place as they reverse that journey now, taking the long curve around the Victoria Memorial and then back up the Mall towards the Admiralty Arch, this very short journey back to Downing Street. And one can only imagine perhaps the conversation or perhaps the silence in the car at that moment.
Yes, and I think actually this speech will determine how long she will now get as Prime Minister. Most people agree that she's finished. She won't contest another election, whenever that election might be. Will it be later this year? Will we have a second election like we did in 1974? Or will the election be at the end of the Brexit process? But Theresa May's prospects of standing as the Conservative leader in that election are pretty much now finished. And I think this speech that she's about to make will determine how long she's going to get. Is it her intention now to go forward to start these Brexit negotiations in 11 days' time? She kept saying during the campaign, didn't she, it's either me or Jeremy Corbyn who would do these negotiations in 11 days' time. I don't think she'd ever thought she'd be in this position where she was leading a minority administration. She couldn't get across the magic 326 MPs and has fewer than she had last time.
I also thought it was one of the kind of big, extraordinary gambles of the campaign that she made it personalised to herself, because, of course, what that does is intends to capitalise on those previously very good leadership ratings, but it puts all of the credit, if she gets it, but it also puts all of the blame onto her. So she has all the blame for this election. We can't say defeat, because obviously it isn't a defeat, but she has all of the blame for these losses. But she's also pointing to herself to, you know, deliver on this Brexit negotiation, and she will be judged on that, and it's going to be incredibly, it was always going to be incredibly difficult.
And that really puts a finger on the sort of dichotomy of this campaign, is that it had her name emblazoned on it, and yet she seemed to be reluctant to give her full self in terms of whether she attended the debates or just the way that she engaged on that campaign. And it's an odd conundrum, that, isn't it?
Well, you know better than anyone else. You were doing a debate with 5 opposition leaders, and there was no Theresa May there, nor did she turn up to the debate that was on another channel later on in the election campaign, and she refused to do them. And whether you watch those debates or not, I think it fed that narrative that she was running away from the questions. She called the election, she didn't have to call it, and people didn't like the fact that she seemed, at least, that she wasn't prepared to answer their questions when that moment came. You know, you just got to look at one of her tweets during the election campaign. She made it, as we were just saying, all about herself. If I lose just 6 seats, she wrote, I will lose this election and Jeremy Corbyn will be sitting down with Europe.
And of course the other conundrum is she made it about Brexit and then didn't talk about Brexit.
And people were persuaded to vote on other issues as well. When all eyes were on what happens in the next few weeks with the Brexit negotiations, there were very many voters who were thinking, what am I experiencing in my own life
Exactly.
now?
So here are the gates to Downing Street. She's sweeping in there with her convoy, very close to that podium.
Let's just watch these pictures unfold and see what Prime Minister Theresa May has to say. So a very different walk up Downing Street to the one we saw last July. Her husband alongside her. Theresa May makes her way to the podium.
I have just been to see Her Majesty the Queen, and I will now form a government that can provide certainty and lead Britain forward at this critical time for our country. This government will guide the country through the crucial Brexit talks that begin in just 10 days and deliver on the will of the British people by taking the United Kingdom out of the European Union. It will work to keep our nation safe and secure by delivering the change that I set out following the appalling attacks in Manchester and London, cracking down on the ideology of Islamist extremism and all those who support it, and giving the police and the authorities the powers they need to keep our country safe. The government I lead will put fairness and opportunity at the heart of everything we do, so that we will fulfil the promise of Brexit together and, over the next 5 years, build a country in which no one and no community is left behind. A country in which prosperity and opportunity are shared right across this United Kingdom. What the country needs more than ever is certainty. And having secured the largest number of votes and the greatest number of seats in the general election, it is clear that only the Conservative and Unionist Party has the legitimacy and ability to provide that certainty by commanding a majority in the House of Commons. As we do, we will continue to work with our friends and allies in the Democratic Unionist Party in particular. Our two parties have enjoyed a strong relationship over many years, and this gives me the confidence to believe that we will be able to work together in the interests of the whole United Kingdom. This will allow us to come together as a country and channel our energies towards a successful Brexit deal that works for everyone in this country, securing a new partnership with the EU which guarantees our long-term prosperity. That's what people voted for last June. That's what we will deliver. Now let's get to work.
Well, a very short statement by the Prime Minister, who now takes her place on the steps of number 10. No smiles on the face on this occasion as she goes back inside, but a very short and to the point speech. She was saying that she intends to form a government with the DUP, clearly keen to stress there, and to work on Brexit to deliver the best deal for Britain and to work to keep the country safe and secure. Carl Dinham, what did you make of it?
Two things really stood out there. One is that the Prime Minister is talking about forming a government which will take Britain into Brexit negotiations and through Brexit and will last for 5 years. She fully intends to go the whole distance of the 5-year Parliament. She doesn't sound like she's anticipating having to stand down any time within that. The other thing that she said that was notable was that she talked about her Conservative and Unionist Party. Now that is the full formal title of the Conservative Party. It's not often used, but it is the Conservative and Unionist Party. And that in one way was her reaching out to the Democratic Unionists from Northern Ireland, on whom she will now rely to be able to get her legislation, in particular her Queen's speech and her budgets, through Parliament. But this was a very sombre Prime Minister and a very sombre husband standing beside her. There were none of the cheering crowds that we've seen when previous Prime Ministers, new Prime Ministers or re-elected Prime Ministers have walked up Downing Street. You could just, as she walked in the door, as we sat here in the street, you could just hear the applause of the Downing Street staff inside. That's a tradition, but really this was a very, very sombre Prime Minister who was returning to form a government, but not the government that she hoped. Now, the next thing on the agenda for her is who's going to be in that government. we had expected, if she'd had a large majority, that she could be looking at a reshuffle this afternoon. The Chancellor next door, his job was questioned. I don't know, and Tory sources that I've spoken to don't know, whether she has the authority to call a reshuffle now, to carry out a reshuffle. Because apart from anything, one thing that reshuffles create is enemies. And Theresa May cannot afford to have any enemies in the Conservative Party that she doesn't have already.
I mean, it was a very spare statement of fact, effectively, wasn't it, Carl?
I expect they are still working things out. Now, interestingly, she did talk about two policy areas aside from Brexit. One was the crackdown on Islamist extremism, the anti-terror kind of project that any government, frankly, walking into Downing Street, any Prime Minister, was going to have to be thinking about after the two terror attacks that we've had during the election campaign. And she also returned to her theme of having a government which will put fairness and opportunity at the heart of all we do. That has been part of Theresa May's project from the day she first became Prime Minister, and she will try and continue with that. But people will be looking for her to try and continue that with a much wider circle of people. That particular part of her agenda was connected particularly with one of her chiefs of staff, Nick Timothy. But Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill, the chiefs of staff, are so closely involved in this election and what went wrong in it. Many within the party want her to look to a much wider circle of people, if not to get rid of them. Now, I don't know if she will get rid of them. One person closely connected to the Tory party told me earlier that Theresa May doesn't make decisions without those two people. Well, she might have to start.
Carl, for the moment, thank you. Let's get some reaction here in the studio. Professor Jane Green and also Chris Shipp, a very short statement, but as Carl pointed to very clearly, planning 5 years, straight back into the front door of number 10, touching, of course, on those conversations with the DUP, but this was a brief statement of intent.
Did you spot any humility? I didn't spot any humility from the Prime Minister there. I mean, we were expecting some form of acknowledgement of what happened last night. Absolutely nothing. I thought it was extraordinary.
I thought there were two things that were absolutely interesting about this. Obviously, she's dealt with the issue with the DUP. There's some understanding that's been come to. But aside from that, there were two things. One is that she talked about the will of the people in last year's election. You know, she talked about delivering the will of the British people on Brexit. So she's still thinking about the 52% of those Leave voters who voted for Brexit. And of course, there was the view after the referendum that it was a narrow win for Leave. It was, of course, a surprising win for Leave, but nevertheless a narrow one. And I thought that was absolutely extraordinary that she was addressing the vote last year but not the vote yesterday. The other thing I thought was extraordinary, she used that phrase about no one left behind, and that had been assumed very much last year to be about this uniting of the right, the idea that the UKIP voters were the left behind from globalisation, from multicultural Britain, and from this, you know, sense of being left behind of economic growth and so on and so forth. And I thought what she was doing was doubling down on the very electoral strategy that she used and which delivered the result that we got last night.
Yes, that just very brief echo of the original speech that she made in Downing Street back in last July, but also a very clear statement on security, which of course was uppermost in everybody's mind in the last 2 weeks.
I thought that speech was almost exactly like one that she could have delivered at the very start of this campaign. It was like, it was classic Theresa May. It was almost robotic in she had a speech, it was the sort of speech you'd expect her to deliver. And she delivered it without any acknowledgement of what happened yesterday. And Jane's right to say she's referring back to delivering the mandate, the referendum mandate from last June, not the recent test of voters, which was last night. No acknowledgement of that whatsoever. And as Carl was just saying, she's now got to try and form a government. That means appointing people to various jobs. How on earth she's going to do that on this very sort of small, without a majority, as a minority government? We're in different times. I mean, you know, we had a formal coalition, remember, in 2010. The last time we had a minority government was way back in the 1970s.
OK, for the moment, thank you. We can cross, actually, over to Belfast and speak to our correspondent, Mark Mallett. And one of the key features of that very brief statement from the Prime Minister was mentioning very clearly working with the DUP, Mark.
Absolutely, Julie. I think that was very evident that she's keen to have the Democratic Unionist Party come on board to help her form that government and to get through the next 5 years or so. Interestingly, not a great amount of detail was let out in that statement, and that's because I think those conversations are still taking place between the DUP and indeed the Conservative Party. The Democratic Unionist Party today, they remain locked in meetings talking about what their red lines will be in order for Theresa May to guarantee their support. We already hinted at some of them in a discussion earlier, Julie. It's going to be that assurance on an Irish referendum to ensure that that issue is put to bed. They're going to want assurances on the likes of legacy issue and of course getting the best possible deal for Northern Ireland in terms of Brexit. DUP sources are telling me that those meetings between party members will continue to take place for the next couple of hours. We are likely to hear from them later this afternoon, and maybe at that stage they will give us an indication as to how far they will be willing to travel to try and help Theresa May.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, in a few moments' time we'll get some further reaction to that very short speech from Theresa May, and we'll be speaking to a former leader of the Conservatives. Do stay with us.